Hello, class. Scott again. First, I'd like to point out that I'm gonna grow a sweet mustache. Since I'm on swings and I don't see my wife too terribly much, I can grow it, and there's not a whole lot of time for her to get angry. So this class will be kind of neat because with these videos, you'll get to see the progression of me going to full stash. And as you've heard, you don't usually go full stash, but I'm totally gonna go full stash. So, besides that. I chose to do another video for this week's discussion question, which I found pretty interesting. Diving right into it, the criticism path that I chose, and even in other classes I felt that I aligned with more than anything, is the reader response criticism. Even as a writer, I never fool myself into believing that what I put on a page is going to be interpreted the same way it means to me. I completely agree that a reader's response is actually what makes a story. It has no real there is no real author intent that can take away from what a reader's response is. It is just as real as the intent that was put on the page. But that's my personal going through the resources. I have a couple things to kind of align why I picked that over the other criticisms. So first and foremost, I'd like to point out that interpretation is everything. So, I mean, we talked about that, or at least I did in my last discussion post about history. Vantage points are very important. In history, you'll have a story, kind of like a novel, a work of fiction, and you take 20 people and you have them read that work of fiction, and you're going to get 20 different responses. None of them is less true or less correct than the other, but they all come together, and from it you can, as a scholar or somebody that wants to actually dive into what that story means, you take all of that. You don't say, hey, read this book, tell me what you think, and then that's the gospel. No, you take 20 reference points on one story, and you're like, man, give me all the best and worst about it. You formulate it, and then you're like, boom, this is what this story means. To me, that's the best type of criticism. Let's see. So a line is drawn by an author for readers to travel upon, but it's not strict. So I made this, and mind you, this is the first time I've ever had to write backwards. So, boom, there you go. So I made this handy dandy little chart to kind of put my idea on paper. The green line is the story. That is the author's overall thought, his plot, her plot, and it also aligns with new criticism, because the whole point of that is to be literal with the text. So along that, reader responses, we travel along that line. There's obviously train tracks right there, straight line. You can't deviate from the plot, but the waving line shows that readers can take from that line and come up with their own interpretations of the story. And it may flow along that axis, but it can still deviate. And it doesn't make it wrong. In fact, it just shows different vantage points of the story. Whereas Marxists and feminists, the reason I put it up there is because it thinks it's above above the story. Sometimes, as you can see, there's points on the graph, it will align with a reader's response. But overall, in my opinion, those criticisms, they try to be above that of the story. They're trying to reach for something greater, some connection to society, to a gender, to a cause, whatever the case may be, but they are trying to elevate above literal text. So to me, I know it seems kind of silly, but that is how I kind of look at these responses. And to me, you want a wide variety because people are different. So what gives you the most variety in response to be a successful critic? Reader responses. So that's mine, trademarked, but you can use it by all means. So yeah, I made that because I was sitting here trying to figure out a way to describe it, and that just seemed like the best way to do it. So going through some of the resources again, Stanley Fish was one of the authors of the reader response criticism books that we're supposed to look at, and it said had a good point that I wanted to relay to you. Okay. He argued that any school of criticism that sees a literary work as an object, claiming to describe what it is and never what it does, misconstrues the very essence of literature and reading. Literature exists and signifies when it is read. So basically, a work of fiction is not, the book itself is an object, but the literature is not. It is its own living being, and if I were to place it into another dynamic, I would put it as people watching at a park. If you have two people sitting down and they're people watching, and literature walks by in front of them, they don't know it's literature, but they see literature walk by. Those two people are going to have different takes on their people watching or literature watching. It's not an object. It's without sounding kooky, it's a living, breathing thing, because inside each reader, we imagine the story. It comes to life. All the characters come to life, and you cannot help whether you're a reader or an author, you can't help but pull from your own experiences. So it becomes real. So for anything to suggest that, like new criticism, what's on the page is gospel. That's all there is to it. There's no interpretation. Those are the words that were meant to be written. Doesn't work that way. It does not work that way. So we also have another thing. No longer is the reader the passive recipient of those ideas that an author has planted in the text. The reader is active. Rosenblatt had said in another one of those resources. So what does that mean? To me, a good correlation to help people understand that the reader response is better. If you take fiction and literature and you put it next to textbooks, when I read a textbook, then I do take what is on the page verbatim. It is cold hard facts. It is meant to be regurgitated. As you come up in your educational career, then you take it in, you hold it, and then you find a way to regurgitate it and research. That's fine. But the bottom line is, if you look at how you read those two things different, that explains everything as to why reader response is so important. You become active. If I'm reading a textbook, I'm being passive. I'm just taking it all in. I'm like, yeah, just give it to me. I'm going to put it back here and I'm going to use it later. But when I'm reading literature, it's all active. It's all going right up here, and at the exact same moment, I'm building a world. I'm interpreting it. When Shakespeare's talking about love, I'm not seeing Romeo as some 13-year-old, white kid with blonde hair. I'm Romeo. I'm putting myself in there. I'm thinking about ways that correlates with me. You can't help but do that. Everybody does. So to think that all the people that read literature, their own interpretation of it doesn't matter is insane, because that's why literature is so big, is because it touches everybody in a different way, and we all bring something to life from it. What else do we got here? I really like this. Fish also said, reader's response is not to the meaning, but is the meaning. And I'll play this off, because let's say I read a book that's horrible. It's just bad from beginning to end. Literature that's bad. If I didn't pull anything from it, there was no meaning. If somebody was like, hey, I heard you read this book, can you tell me about it? What emotions did it pull out of you? None. It was a bad book. So obviously there was no meaning to me. Now that doesn't mean that somebody else doesn't. But if we take on a large scale a piece of literature and a majority of the people feel that way, then there was no meaning to that book. Doesn't matter what the author's meaning was, because if the reader didn't get a meaning, whether it was on point with the author or it skewed on that line, it had no meaning. And that's crucial. A reader's response is what makes literature important. So Fish's statement was spot on with that one. So now I'm going to talk about what benefits do you believe your selected framework offers to interpretation of the text that is superior to the others. So my little note I have here is the framework puts each reader, regardless of skill or education, in the driver's seat. It doesn't matter if it's my 6-year-old daughter or my 7-year-old daughter who is attempting to read Harry Potter, or 28-year-old me who's read every book over the years and has been, through more schooling. Her interpretation of Harry Potter is just as important as a 6-year-old. It fits a demographic. It fits a 7-year-old reading Harry Potter as much as a college graduate interpreting what he read in Harry Potter. Whereas when we look at new criticism or Marxists and feminists, my 7-year-old doesn't play a factor in that. She's not going to maybe understand what, Rowling was trying to get at in the story. She's definitely not going to understand these two categories. So what we have effectively done is we have taken out all of this room for every other person, because literature is not only for scholars. Reading is not only for scholars. That is for everybody. So it has to. They're too focused in, and I don't appreciate that. I think that when it comes to literature and everything, it needs to be broad. Everybody has an opinion on the arts, and everybody has a right to have an opinion, because we're talking about emotion. So that is why I think it is superior to the others. So now we're going to get into more complex lookings, which my opinion does change. For instance, the relationship between text and author, obviously new criticism takes the best there. When you want to know the correlation between the text and the author, and I've talked about that in another paper I've wrote that I think is really important. When you read a book, no matter the genre, you're getting the author's interpretation of society. Plain and simple. I look back into school reading Huckleberry Finn, and it's so taboo because, they use the N-word in the book. But what that does is it's giving you an unadulterated look at what that author saw in society. So by that, you can pull from history facts through fiction. And that's really important. And to me, that's a big part of new criticism. It is, look, I want to know what the author was thinking, or maybe even what the author was living through at that time. So you want to get to that new criticism. You want to get down and dirty to what was written on the page. So to me, that's the best option if you want to correlate between text and author. Now, between reader and scholar, I believe there's a blend between reader response and Marxist, because in my opinion, if you're a scholar, you're elevating. You're no longer just looking at what you interpreted from a book. You're going to take the 20 people that read that book. You're realizing that you want to elevate past yourself and look at society. You want to look at generations. You want to make it a more of a social aspect. So you have to have a blend of the two. Sure, you make a benchmark. You're like, cool. Society during this generation felt this way in literature. Boom, across the board. Well, how do you get there? Through reader responses. That's the only way you can. So you got to have a blend of the two before you can, or you have to have the reader response before you can come to a Marxist kind of mentality, which I think is a good tool for those of us in school like this. And that goes back to my previous point that authors cannot leave out social inputs from their own life. I don't care if you're talking strictly fiction, fantasy. There's some piece of the author in that story that can be pulled out from the society they lived in. And then lastly, conversely, which of the 4 frameworks do you believe would be the least effective for these purposes? Feminists. I didn't do any extra research past what was in the module notes, so I really hope there's more to it than what was in there. But it seemed pretty presumptuous to me. I live in a world, I mean, I'm not Hispanic at all, even though I look at pretty much anywhere I go, somebody thinks I'm something different. It just depends on the region. Brown's a pretty universal color. But in all actuality, my mom is blended with many Caucasian, backgrounds. My dad is black and Cherokee, and I end up with this cool brown skin and blue eyes. But me and my wife, my wife and I, especially being military, we are very equal. We believe in equality. And for this, I wanted to tell you guys a funny story. We're playing life with our children, 7, 6 years old. At the time, 6 and 5, my son, 5. And we got to a point where my son was supposed to get married. So it's like, oh, Brandon's going to get married. That's cool. And my wife looks at Brandon. We're all having a good time. She's like, so do you marry a boy or a girl? And Brandon just looks at her and he's like, well, I have to marry a girl, right? And Val looked at me and I was like, you can marry whoever you want to marry. and that's kind of the way Val and I look at things. Why do we need to put categories out there if we're all equal? I don't care what Brandon does. He's my son. He can be happy whichever way he wants. Same with my daughter. Same with my neighbor. But what I think the real problem is, and I know this is a little off topic of literature, is if we truly break down these categories and get rid of the segregation and criticisms and all that, what actually happens is a lot of people stop being special in essence. You tear down all this inequality, and then you start to lose superiority. You no longer have that to fall back on. Like, well, wait a minute. Now it's, everybody's just one in the bunch. Sooner or later, everybody's going to look like me. Sooner or later, we're all going to, get in that giant melting pot, and then we're all going to look like me anyways. But that's where I think feminist is just, it's too specific. And to me, it seems kind of pointless. If I'm a scholar, I want a more broad, I want to appeal to everybody, and I want to know everybody as a whole. I'm sure there are specific instances where that would work, but from what I read, I was like, no, that's not going to work for my broad want of gathering information. So this has been my take on criticism. So as I said, I am all for reader responses. Look forward to next week's mustache growth. It's going to get there. So I hope everybody has a wonderful week, and thanks for watching. Bye.